The stars do not ask to which people they belong, yet we who gaze upon them must know from where we come. For in the vastness of the cosmos, it is the smallness of our roots that gives us the courage to reach upward. I have spent my life studying the laws that bind the universe together, the invisible forces that hold galaxies in their dance, the curvature of space itself. And yet, I find myself returning again and again to a simpler question, one that cannot be solved with equations. What does it mean to belong? Not to a nation with borders drawn by men, but to a people whose history is written in perseverance, in books carried across deserts, in questions asked by candlelight, when the world outside demanded only silence. There are those who say that in a rational world, such attachments should fade, that science erases boundaries, that enlightenment makes us all citizens of everywhere, and therefore nowhere. But I have learned that the universe does not work this way. A particle may appear in two places at once, yet it is still itself. Identity is not a wall. It is a foundation upon which we build our capacity to see beyond ourselves. When I speak of our people, I speak not of superiority, but of continuity. We are a small community, bound not by soil alone, but by something more mysterious, a shared sense of questioning, of wrestling with meaning, of refusing easy answers. In every generation, there have been those who wish to dissolve this bond, to assimilate into invisibility, believing that sameness would bring safety. But history has taught us a harsh lesson. The world will not forget us simply because we forget ourselves. Zionism, to me, is not merely a political response to hatred, though hatred has certainly given it urgency. It is something deeper, a recognition that a people without a center, without a place where their spirit can develop freely, becomes like light scattered by a prism, beautiful perhaps, but lacking coherence. We need not all live in one place, but we must have one place where we are not guests, where our children can grow without apology, where the music of our language and our thought can flourish without interruption. I do not believe in nationalism. The worship of the state has led to horrors I cannot adequately describe, the mechanization of cruelty, the reduction of human beings to numbers, to problems to be solved. But there is a difference between the aggressive nationalism that seeks to dominate and the quiet determination of a people to simply exist, to have one small corner of this vast earth where they may live according to their own conscience. Some will say this is tribalism, that it contradicts the ideal of universal brotherhood. But I have found that those who love humanity in the abstract often struggle to love any particular human being. The universal grows from the particular. We learn compassion first within our family, then our community, and only then can we extend it to all of humankind. To ask a people to abandon their identity in the name of unity is to demand that the tree forget its roots in order to reach the sky. Palestine, to me, represents something beyond politics. It is a laboratory where an old people might prove that suffering can produce wisdom rather than bitterness, that we can build a society not on dominance, but on cooperation, not on the glorification of power, but on the cultivation of the mind. A place where Arab and Jew might find that they have more in common in their love of the land than in the ideologies that separate them. This is perhaps naive. I am a physicist after all, more comfortable with equations than with the messy realities of human conflict. But naivety, I think, is sometimes just another word for hope that refuses to surrender. I worry, though. I worry that in our justified desire for security, we might become what we fled from, that the victim might study too well the methods of his oppressor, that in building walls to keep out hatred, we might trap ourselves inside them. A nation, like a person, must know when to be strong and when to be generous. The two are not opposites. True strength includes the courage to be vulnerable, to risk trust, even when trust has been betrayed. What I wish for our people is not power, but purpose, not a fortress, but a home, not isolation, but a center from which we can engage with the world, contributing our particular gifts to the common treasury of human civilization. For thousands of years, we have survived by the strength of our ideas, by our insistence on learning, on questioning, on refusing to accept the world as it is when it could be better. This tradition is more precious than any territory. In the end, I return to where I began, to the stars that do not care about our small distinctions, and yet to the earth where those distinctions shape our lives. We are made of stardust, all of us, every human being on this planet. We are also made of stories, of memories, of languages that carry within them centuries of accumulated wisdom. To lose this would be to make the universe a little less complex, a little less interesting, a little less itself. I do not have all the answers. I suspect no one does. But I know this: a people has the right to exist, to remember, to dream in their own tongue. Not at the expense of others, but alongside them. Not in superiority, but in dignity. The same dignity I demand for every human soul, regardless of the name they call their God or the place they call their home. Let us build, then, not monuments to our past sufferings, but gardens where our children might play without fear. Not walls, but bridges. Not an empire, but a community, one that remembers where it came from and therefore knows how to welcome the stranger. For we were strangers once, and not so long ago that we should forget. Identity as foundation, not barrier. Einstein argues that identity isn't a wall separating people, but a foundation that enables us to see beyond ourselves. Just as a particle remains itself even in quantum superposition, people can maintain their cultural identity while engaging with the universal. The particular and the universal are not opposites. One grows from the other. You know, I have always found it curious how people speak of identity as though it were a prison, as though to know oneself is somehow to limit oneself. They say we must transcend our particular origins, our tribal attachments, our small loyalties. And there is truth in this, I suppose. The worst crimes in history have been committed by those who believe their group superior to all others, who saw the world divided into us and them with such rigid certainty that compassion became impossible. I understand this fear. I have lived through it. But here is what troubles me. In our eagerness to escape the dangers of narrow identity, we sometimes forget that identity itself is not the enemy. A foundation is not a cage. Consider the tree. It does not apologize for its roots. Without them, it cannot reach toward the light. It cannot spread its branches, cannot offer shade to the traveler, cannot participate in the great conversation of the forest. The roots do not limit the tree, they make its freedom possible. I think of my own life, and I see this paradox everywhere. I am a Jew, yes, but I am also a physicist, a pacifist, a lover of Mozart, a person who finds great pleasure in sailing, though I am quite terrible at it. Which of these is the real me? The question makes no sense. I am all of these things, and they do not contradict one another. My Jewish heritage taught me to question, to value learning above all else, to see the world as fundamentally intelligible. And these lessons shaped the physicist I became. When I work on equations describing the curvature of space-time, I am not leaving my identity behind, I am expressing it in a particular way. The mistake, I think, is believing that to be universal, one must first become nothing in particular. But this is like saying that to appreciate all music, one must first forget how to hear one's mother tongue. The opposite is true. We learn to love humanity by first loving particular human beings, our parents, our friends, the grocer who remembers how we take our coffee. We learn to value all cultures by first understanding deeply at least one culture, by knowing its songs and stories from the inside, by feeling in our bones what it means to belong somewhere. Zionism as cultural preservation, not nationalism. He presents Zionism not as aggressive nationalism or merely a response to persecution, but as a necessary center where Jewish spirit and culture can develop freely. Like light scattered by a prism, a people without a cultural home lacks coherence. He emphasizes the need for one place where Jewish children can grow without apology, where their traditions can flourish uninterrupted. There is a word I have never much liked, nationalism. It conjures images of marching boots, of flags waved with such fervor that they become weapons, of young men sent to die for ideas they barely understand. I have seen what happens when love of country turns into worship of the state, when pride becomes arrogance, when the desire to protect one's own becomes the desire to dominate others. And so when people hear me speak of Zionism, they sometimes become confused, even suspicious. But Einstein, they say, you who have spoken so eloquently against nationalism, against militarism, against the tribal hatreds that poison our world, how can you support this? And I understand their confusion. It is a reasonable question. But here is what I wish them to understand. There is a difference, a profound difference, between the nationalism that seeks power and the simple human need for a home. Imagine, if you will, a violin, a beautiful instrument, capable of producing sounds that can move the soul to tears. But if this violin has no case, if it must be carried from place to place exposed to every rain and wind, if it can never rest safely anywhere, then slowly, inevitably, it will be damaged. The strings will loosen, the wood will crack, the voice will fade. Not because the violin is weak, but because it has no shelter. This is how I think of a people without a center, without a place where their culture can develop freely, without interruption. For 2,000 years, we have been that violin, carried from land to land, sometimes welcomed, often tolerated, too often persecuted. And yes, we have survived. This itself is remarkable, perhaps miraculous. But survival is not the same as flourishing. A plant may survive in poor soil, sending out desperate roots, clinging to life, but it will never reach its full height, never produce the flowers of which it is capable. When I speak of Zionism, I speak of creating conditions where Jewish culture, our particular way of questioning, our emphasis on learning, our ethical traditions, our language that carries within it 3,000 years of accumulated wisdom, can develop naturally without the constant need to defend itself, to apologize for itself, to compress itself into forms acceptable to others. This is not supremacy, it is simply space to breathe. Think of it this way. In physics, we speak of degrees of freedom, the number of independent ways a system can move or change. A gas molecule in a large container has many degrees of freedom. It can move in any direction, can occupy any position within that space. But compress that molecule into a tiny corner, surround it with walls on every side, and suddenly its degrees of freedom collapse. It is still the same molecule with the same properties, but it cannot express them fully. It bounces frantically from wall to wall, expending energy merely to maintain its existence rather than to explore its possibilities. For centuries, Jewish communities have lived with diminished degrees of freedom, permitted to exist, perhaps, but always as guests, always dependent on the tolerance of others, always aware that this tolerance could be withdrawn at any moment. And yes, within these constraints, remarkable things have been achieved. But I cannot help wondering what might be possible if we had one place, just one small corner of this vast earth, where our degrees of freedom were not artificially constrained, where a Jewish child could grow up speaking Hebrew as naturally as breathing, where scholars could debate Talmudic interpretation or modern physics without needing to explain themselves to a skeptical. The hope for cooperation over domination, Einstein envisions Palestine as a laboratory where an ancient people might prove that suffering produces wisdom rather than bitterness. He hopes for a society built on cooperation between Arab and Jew, on cultivation of the mind rather than glorification of power. However, he expresses deep concern that in seeking security, the oppressed might adopt the methods of their oppressors. I have often thought that suffering is the great teacher of humanity, though it is a cruel pedagogy, and one wishes there might be gentler ways to learn wisdom. When I look at the history of my people, I see a long catalogue of persecutions, exiles, massacres, enough pain to justify any amount of bitterness, any degree of mistrust toward the world. And yet, what strikes me most is not how much bitterness has resulted, but how little. That after all this, there remains among us a stubborn insistence on learning, on ethics, on the possibility that human beings might still choose reason over violence. This seems to me almost irrational, this persistence of hope. But perhaps the irrational is sometimes wiser than we know. So when I think about Palestine, about what we might build there, I confess I harbor a perhaps foolish dream, not a fortress, not a nation-state in the old European sense, bristling with weapons and suspicions, but something more interesting, more difficult, more necessary, a laboratory of cooperation, a place where we might demonstrate that the victim need not become the oppressor, that power need not corrupt, that memory of suffering can lead to compassion rather than cruelty. Is this naive? Almost certainly. But I have spent my life studying the universe, and I have learned that the most beautiful solutions are often those that seem impossible at first glance. The land itself, you see, does not care about our arguments. The olive trees do not ask whether they are being tended by Arab hands or Jewish hands. The rain falls on everyone equally. The sun makes no distinction. And the people who have lived there for generations, the Arab farmers, the villagers, the shepherds, they too have roots in that soil. They too have songs about those hills. This is not an abstraction to me. When I think of building a Jewish home in Palestine, I do not imagine it can be done by erasing those who are already there, by pretending the land was empty, by repeating the very crimes that were committed against us in Europe. What would be the point of such a thing? We would have traveled thousands of miles only to become what we fled from. No, what I imagine, and I admit this may be the imagination of a physicist who spends too much time in the realm of theory, is something more complex, more delicate. A shared society, not the kind of tolerance where we simply agree to ignore each other, to keep to our separate corners, but a genuine meeting of cultures. The Arab brings his knowledge of the land, his traditions of hospitality, his poetry. The Jew brings his commitment to education, his particular genius for asking uncomfortable questions, his experience of maintaining identity across diaspora. And together, perhaps, we create something neither could create alone. I know the obstacles. I am not blind to the hatred that already exists, the violence that has already been committed on both sides. There are those who will say that such cooperation is impossible, that the wounds are too deep, that one side or the other must dominate. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps I am like a man standing before a locked door, imagining that if he describes the other side beautifully enough, the door will simply open. But doors do sometimes open, you know. Universal dignity through particular memory. He concludes that all humans are made of stardust, yet also made of stories, memories, and languages carrying centuries of wisdom. Every people has the right to exist, remember, and dream in their own tongue, not at the expense of others, but alongside them. True strength includes the courage to welcome strangers, remembering we were strangers once, and not so long ago. When I look up at the night sky, which I still do, despite knowing more than most people about what I am seeing, I am struck by a peculiar thought. Every atom in my body was once inside a star, the iron in my blood, the calcium in my bones, the carbon that forms the very structure of my cells, all of it was forged in the nuclear furnace of some ancient sun that exploded billions of years ago, scattering its contents across space. In this sense, I am literally made of stardust, and so are you. So is every person who has ever lived, regardless of their religion, their nationality, their place in whatever hierarchies we humans have invented. This should humble us, I think. When we understand that we are all composed of the same fundamental materials, arranged by the same physical laws, it becomes harder to maintain the fiction that some people are inherently superior to others. The universe makes no such distinctions. A hydrogen atom in a Jewish body behaves exactly like a hydrogen atom in an Arab body, in a Christian body, in an atheist body. The laws of physics are ruthlessly egalitarian. And yet, and this is what fascinates me, we are not merely collections of atoms. We are also collections of stories. The carbon in my bones may be no different from anyone else's carbon, but the memories stored in the patterns of my neurons are uniquely mine, shaped by a particular history, a particular language, a particular way of seeing the world. I grew up speaking German, reading Goethe, later learning Hebrew with its peculiar way of connecting past and present in every verb. These things have shaped how I think, how I perceive, how I solve problems. They are not incidental details about me, they are part of what makes me capable of thinking at all. So here is the puzzle that occupies my mind. How do we hold both truths simultaneously? That we are all fundamentally the same, stardust obeying the same laws, and yet also fundamentally different, each carrying a unique inheritance of language, memory, tradition. The easy answer is to choose one truth and ignore the other. Some people focus only on our commonality and become impatient with any expression of particular identity, seeing it as primitive, as divisive. Others focus only on difference and become trapped in tribal thinking, unable to recognize the humanity of those outside their group. But I suspect that both approaches are too simple, that reality, as it so often does, demands that we think in more complex ways. Perhaps the universal and the particular are not enemies but partners, each necessary to make sense of the other. Perhaps dignity itself requires both dimensions, the recognition that every human being has the same fundamental worth, and simultaneously, that each human being has the right to their own particular story, their own language, their own way of remembering. And so I return to where all journeys of thought must eventually lead, to the question of how we might live. Not in some distant, perfected future, but here, now, with all our contradictions intact. We are stardust that remembers, atoms that dream, universal beings with particular hearts. Let us build, then, with both humility and hope, knowing we cannot escape our nature as tribal creatures, yet refusing to be imprisoned by it. Let us create spaces where identity flourishes without demanding conformity, where memory serves wisdom rather than vengeance, where the particular and universal dance together rather than war. This is not idealism, this is physics. Everything in the universe seeks balance, and we are no exception.